Stupidity, the most dangerous force. We choose to ignore. We like to believe that evil is the greatest threat to humanity, that it wears a monstrous face, speaks in hatred, and acts with malice. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer, it is not evil, but stupidity that poses the greatest danger to society, not refuses to think, to question, to reflect. In Bonhoeffer's eyes, absence of will to engage the mind and confront reality. The terrifying part is that stupidity hides behind ordinary faces. It wears a smile. It sounds agreeable. It blends in. But underneath the surface lies something far more destructive. A passive mind that surrenders to authority, obeys without questioning, and clings to comforting lies over uncomfortable truths. Unlike evil, which can be reason, Bonhoeffer saw how entire populations fell under the spell of authoritarianism, not because they were evil, but because they stopped thinking. They outsourced their judgment. They silenced their conscience. And without ever lifting a weapon, they became part of something ma. This is the true horror of stupidity. It is not loud. It is not violent, but it is devastating. It allows evil to thrive unnoticed. And in today's world, where shallow thinking spreads faster than truth, Bonhoeffer's warning is more urgent than ever. A society that stops thinking becomes a society that forgets how to be human. When power meets passivity, how authoritarianism feeds on stupidity. One of the most chilling truths Dietrich Bonhoeffer uncovered is this: authoritarian regimes do not rise solely through violence or hatred. They rise through the silent compliance of passive minds. Stu Bonhoeffer saw it happen firsthand under the shadow of Nazi Germany. The regime's strength wasn't just in its weapons. It was in the countless ordinary people who chose not to think. They did an unquestioning obedience. Power thrives in this environment. It rewards those who comply and silences those who question. It surrounds itself with sycophants and punishes dissent. And slowly, without violence, it shapes a society where rational thought is replaced by blind allegiance. That is the real threat. Not just evil at the top, but stupidity at the bottom. Millions of people who stop thinking, who surrender their moral agency, and who become, unknowingly, the gears of oppression. When critical thinking dies, freedom doesn't vanish overnight. It simply fades until no one remembers what it felt like. The corrupting influence of power. When thinking becomes dangerous, power has a strange effect on the human mind. At first, it promises control, security, and influence. But over time, it begins to corrode something far more precious: the will to think critically. Bonhoeffer warned that stupidity becomes especially dangerous when it fuses with power. When individuals rise to positions of authority, something subtle yet profound begins to shift. Surrounded by loyalty, flattery, and fear of dissent, they slowly lose their grip on self-awareness. Independent thought becomes an inconvenience, not a necessity. And in that silence, where critical voices are filtered out and only affirmation remains, intellectual passivity grows like a shadow. In powerful institutions, conformity is rewarded and questioning is punished. Leaders stop asking hard questions. They surround themselves with advisors who mirror their beliefs, not challenge them. They build echo chambers where poor decisions echo back as sound strategy, and where incompetence is mistaken for confidence. The result isn't just bad leadership. It's a system built on hollow certainty and unexamined arrogance. But the danger isn't just at the top. It trickles down. When those in power reject thoughtfulness, it sends a clear message to the rest of society. Thinking critically is a threat. Obedience is virtue. And so, the people follow suit. not because they're evil, but because they're conditioned to believe that silence is safer than thought. This is how societies decay, not through sudden collapse, but through the slow erosion of intellectual courage. And if we don't protect the value of reflection, doubt, and honest questioning, we risk building a world where power is loud and thought is silent, a world where obedience becomes a virtue and thinking becomes an act of rebellion. The banality of evil. When ordinary people stop thinking, we often imagine evil as something monstrous, something distant, foreign, inhuman. But what if the true face of evil is not monstrous at all? What if it's ordinary? That was the haunting insight of political theorist Hannah Arendt, who studied the mind behind one of history's greatest horrors, the Holocaust. In her analysis of Adolf Eichmann, a man who helped orchestrate mass murder not as a monster, but as a bureaucrat following orders, Arendt revealed something deeply unsettling. Evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers in routine, in silence, in thoughtlessness. Eichmann wasn't driven by hatred. He wasn't a sadist. He was disturbingly normal. A man who sat behind a desk, shuffled papers, signed documents, and sent millions to their deaths. Not because he hated them, but because he never stopped to think about what he was doing. His crime wasn't rage. It was indifference. His guilt wasn't passion. It was obedience without reflection. This Arendt called the banality of evil, the terrifying idea that unspeakable harm can be committed by people who simply stop asking questions, people who trade conscience for compliance, people who silence their own minds to fit inside the system. And it's not just history. We see echoes of this every day. When people obey policies they know are wrong, when they follow orders instead of their morals, when they choose comfort over conscience. That is where evil hides, in the thoughtless routines of ordinary people. Arendt's warning is clear. When we stop thinking, we stop being moral beings. And when that happens, we don't just become bystanders to injustice. We become its silent instruments. The most dangerous evil isn't always fueled by hate. It's often fueled by the absence of thought. The patterns still haunt us. When thoughtlessness becomes a way of life, we'd like to believe we've evolved, that the dark chapters of history, where ordinary people enabled unthinkable atrocities through blind obedience, are behind us. But the truth is far more uncomfortable. The very patterns Bonhoeffer and Arendt warned us about are not relics of the past. They're alive and well, woven into the fabric of modern life. Only now, they wear new disguises. Today, thoughtlessness doesn't always march in uniform or salute authority. It scrolls endlessly through screens. It nods in agreement with whatever opinion sounds popular. It wraps itself in flags, corporate slogans, political party lines, and hashtags, never pausing to ask, is this right or is this true? Conformity has become more subtle, but no less dangerous. People are rewarded for fitting in, not for thinking deeply. Questioning the system, whether in politics, workplaces, or social circles, is often met with suspicion, hostility, or even shame. Just like in Eichmann's world, modern systems still reward obedience and punish reflection. Employees carry out harmful policies because it's just company protocol. Citizens support harmful ideologies because that's just how it's always been. Moral courage is replaced by professional detachment. Critical thought is dismissed as cynicism. And loyalty, no matter how blind, is praised as virtue. But perhaps most troubling is how intellectual laziness is often mistaken for patriotism or social unity. people believe they are standing for truth, when in fact they are merely echoing the loudest voice around them. In this climate, doing the right thing quietly becomes radical. Asking honest questions becomes rebellious. And thinking for yourself becomes a burden few are willing to carry. Yet if we've learned anything from the past, it's that when a society stops thinking, it starts decaying from within. The structures may still stand, but the moral foundation begins to rot. The danger isn't just in what people do, it's in what they no longer dare to question. When foolishness becomes a virtue and intelligence a threat, there was a time when wisdom was admired, when thoughtfulness, complexity, and nuance were signs of strength. But philosopher Bertrand Russell saw a darker shift unfolding, and his warning rings even louder in our world today. Foolishness is triumphing over intelligence. In a culture that favors speed over depth, certainty over inquiry, and popularity over truth, intelligence is no longer celebrated. It's often punished. We see it everywhere. The loudest voices, not the wisest, dominate public discourse. The most simplistic answers, not the most thoughtful, are the ones that get applause. Leaders rise to power not because they offer real solutions, but because they deliver comforting slogans, catchy, emotional, and dangerously empty. Critical thinking is treated like a burden, while ignorance is repackaged as authenticity. And so, the intelligent shrink back. The deep thinkers are dismissed as elitist or out of touch. Complexity is mocked, nuance is ignored, and we begin to praise the very traits that weaken society's moral and intellectual foundation. It's not that people can't understand complex issues, it's that the system no longer encourages them to try. Russell knew the cost of this cultural decay. A society that rewards ignorance breeds complacency, conformity, and eventually, collapse. It creates a world where truth is optional and appearances are everything. But the real tragedy is that those capable of changing the world, those who question, reflect, and imagine, are silenced before they ever get the chance. If we do not fight for intelligence, for reason, for depth, we will be left with a world governed by noise, not thought. And that is a future we cannot afford. The social contagion of stupidity, how thoughtlessness spreads like a virus. Stupidity isn't just an individual flaw, it's a social contagion, a force that spreads silently but rapidly, infecting minds not through logic, but through emotion, repetition, and belonging. It doesn't need to shout to be powerful. All it needs is for people to stop thinking for themselves and start mirroring what everyone else seems to believe. That's how it grows, not in a vacuum, but in groups, in movements, in institutions, in everyday conversations, where independent thought is quietly replaced by consensus. People don't wake up one day and decide to abandon reason. It happens slowly, often invisibly. They begin to absorb the ideas that surround them. Not because those ideas are true or meaningful, but because they're popular, familiar, or emotionally satisfying. The desire to belong, to not stand out, to not rock the boat, is stronger than most people realize. And so, they conform. They repeat slogans. They adopt worldviews that require no thought, just allegiance. Before they know it, they've become carriers of a narrative they never questioned. When foolishness becomes a virtue and intelligence a threat. There was a time when wisdom was admired, when thoughtfulness, complexity, and nuance were signs of strength. But philosopher Bertrand Russell saw a darker shift unfolding, and his warning rings even louder in our world today. Foolishness is triumphing over intelligence. In a culture that favors speed over depth, certainty over inquiry, and popularity over truth, intelligence is no longer celebrated, it's often punished. We see it everywhere. The loudest voices, not the wisest, dominate public discourse. The most simplistic answers, not the most thoughtful, are the ones that get applause. Leaders rise to power not because they offer real solutions, but because they deliver comforting slogans, catchy, emotional, and dangerously empty. Critical thinking is treated like a burden, while ignorance is repackaged as authenticity. And so, the intelligent shrink back. The deep thinkers are dismissed as elitist or out of touch. Complexity is mocked, nuance is ignored, and we begin to praise the very traits that weaken society's moral and intellectual foundation. It's not that people can't understand complex issues, it's that the system no longer encourages them to try. Russell knew the cost of this cultural decay. A society that rewards ignorance breeds complacency, conformity, and eventually collapse. It creates a world where truth is optional and appearances are everything. But the real tragedy is that those capable of changing the world, those who question, reflect, and imagine, are silenced before they ever get the chance. If we do not fight for intelligence, for reason, for depth, we will be left with a world governed by noise, not thought. And that is a future we cannot afford. The social contagion of stupidity. How thoughtlessness spreads like a virus. Stupidity isn't just an individual flaw, it's a social contagion, a force that spreads silently but rapidly, infecting minds not through logic but through emotion, repetition, and belonging. It doesn't need to shout to be powerful. All it needs is for people to stop thinking for themselves and start mirroring what everyone else seems to believe. That's how it grows, not in a vacuum, but in groups, in movements, in institutions, in everyday conversations, where independent thought is quietly replaced by consensus. People don't wake up one day and decide to abandon reason. It happens slowly, often invisibly. They begin to absorb the ideas that surround them, not because those ideas are true or meaningful, but because they are popular, familiar, or emotionally satisfying. The desire to belong, to not stand out, to not rock the boat, is stronger than most people realize. And so, they conform. They repeat slogans. They adopt worldviews that require no thought, just allegiance. Before they know it, they've become carriers of a narrative they never questioned. Social media has only made this worse. In a digital age where attention is currency, truth is often drowned by noise, and critical thought becomes inconvenient. Algorithms don't promote accuracy, they promote engagement. And the more provocative, simplified, or emotionally charged a message is, the faster it spreads. What was once thoughtful debate has been replaced by reaction, outrage, and tribal echo chambers. Thinking deeply has become an act of rebellion in a world addicted to surface-level stimulation. But this contagion does more than misinform. It erodes our moral responsibility. When people stop questioning, they stop caring. When they surrender thought, they surrender accountability. And that's how societies decay. Not through one great collapse, but through millions of small moments where individuals choose comfort over conscience, belonging over truth, noise over thought. We must wake up to this, because if stupidity can spread like a virus, so can critical thinking, courage, and moral clarity. But only if we choose to pass it on. The slow death of independent thought. When groupthink replaces truth. One of the most dangerous consequences of widespread stupidity is not just the spread of bad ideas, it's the disappearance of diverse thinking altogether. When a society becomes intellectually lazy, it doesn't just stop asking hard questions. it begins to punish those who do. This is how groupthink takes over, not in a single moment, but in a slow, suffocating process, where the pressure to conform gradually overpowers the courage to think freely. It begins subtly. People start echoing the same phrases, parroting the same ideas, not because they've examined them, but because everyone else seems to believe them. Dissent becomes uncomfortable. Nuance is treated like betrayal. The goal shifts from understanding to agreement. And those who ask deeper questions are labeled as difficult, divisive, or even dangerous. Over time, this intellectual homogenization creates a culture where consensus is valued more than truth, and social harmony is placed above moral clarity. People no longer pursue what is right. They pursue what is safe, what is acceptable, what won't get them criticized or excluded. And so, originality dies quietly, suffocated under the weight of social pressure. This is the hidden cruelty of groupthink. It doesn't just silence ideas. It silences people. It isolates the thinkers, the challengers, the ones who see things differently. It teaches us that it's better to blend in than to stand up, that it's better to be accepted than to be honest. And before we know it, a society that once celebrated free thought becomes a society of shadows, where people stop speaking their minds and eventually stop knowing what they believe at all. But the tragedy runs deeper. When we stop allowing space for disagreement, we stop evolving. Progress is born from tension, from dialogue, from ideas that challenge the status quo. A world without intellectual diversity is a world that cannot grow. It can only repeat itself. If we want a future worth living in, we must fight for the right to think differently, speak honestly, and ask uncomfortable questions. Because a society that fears difference is a society that has already forgotten what freedom really means. And in that silence, stupidity finds its greatest victory. Not by force, but by quiet submission. Breaking the cycle, choosing thought over comfort. If stupidity is a social disease, then critical thinking is the cure. And it starts with the courage to think when it's easier not to. Escaping the grip of intellectual passivity isn't a single heroic act. It's a daily choice, a lifelong commitment to stay awake in a world that wants you numb. The truth is, it takes strength to resist the easy path of conformity. It takes humility to admit when we're wrong. It takes courage to question authority in a culture that punishes dissent. But this is exactly what our future depends on. The first step is to reclaim our minds. We must learn to think again, not just to consume opinions, but to challenge them, dissect them, understand where they come from and what they mean. That's not elitism, it's responsibility. It's refusing to let someone else do our thinking for us. We also need to practice intellectual humility, to acknowledge the limits of our knowledge and stay open to growth. When we stop pretending to have all the answers, we create space for truth to emerge. And in that space, dialogue can thrive. Surround yourself with people who challenge you, not just agree with you. Seek out discomfort. Ask questions even when they make others uncomfortable. And never forget that media literacy is not optional anymore. It's survival. Learn to question not just what you hear, but why you're hearing it. Because if stupidity is contagious, then so is wisdom. And the more we model independent thought, moral reflection, and quiet courage, the more others will follow. Change doesn't begin with the masses. It begins with one person choosing to think when it's easier to stay silent. Let that person be you. A final stand against silence. Thought is our greatest act of resistance. In the end, it's not just about intellect, it's about responsibility. Bonhoeffer, Arendt, and Russell didn't simply diagnose a problem. They issued a warning, a call to arms for every thinking, feeling human being. Because the truth is chilling. Evil doesn't always need hatred to thrive. It just needs enough people to stop thinking. And when we abandon reflection, when we trade conscience for comfort, we don't just lose our freedom, we lose our humanity. This is our moment to decide what kind of people we want to be. Will we choose the ease of conformity or the difficult, uncomfortable path of truth? Will we echo what's popular or will we speak what's right, even when our voices tremble? These aren't abstract questions. They are moral choices that shape our workplaces, our communities, our culture, our future. Every time we ask a hard question, every time we challenge a shallow narrative, every time we choose integrity over acceptance, we push back against the creeping fog of stupidity. And in that pushback, we reclaim something essential: our capacity to think, to feel, to act with purpose. The world doesn't need more followers. It needs resistors. It needs people willing to think deeply, to listen with care, to stand alone when necessary. Because a free society doesn't survive on laws alone. It survives on the minds and hearts of those who dare to question. So think bravely, speak honestly, live deliberately. The world is waiting, and history is watching. A timeless lesson for everyday life. Think, question, and stay awake. The most powerful lesson from all of this is simple, yet deeply urgent. Never surrender your mind. In a world that rewards obedience and discourages reflection, your ability to think critically isn't just a skill, it's an act of resistance. Whether it's at work, in your community, or even within your own beliefs, you have a responsibility to question what's presented to you. Don't confuse conformity with integrity. Don't trade truth for comfort. The ease of going along with the crowd may feel safe, but it's often the beginning of something far more dangerous: the slow erosion of your moral compass. You don't have to be a scholar or philosopher to live thoughtfully. You just need the courage to ask, why? And the humility to admit when you're wrong. Surround yourself with people who challenge your thinking, not just echo it. Be the voice that speaks when others stay silent. Because in a society that's increasingly noisy and shallow, quiet reflection is a radical act. And if we want a better world, more just, more human, more free, it begins with the simple, everyday choice to stay awake, stay curious, and keep thinking.